welcome you.
Well, thank you very much, everybody, for coming this afternoon. I really appreciate it. I'm going to make this really very informal because it's a good opportunity to kind of talk as opposed to just having me present. But what I want to do is start off with a video that we showed at our recent leadership conference in Omaha. This is a brand new video, only a couple months old, and it kind of gets you in the spirit. So. Okay, that white stuff, that's snow.
Is there a temperature when the train can't run, when it's too cold?
Theoretically, there probably is. Certainly stresses the track and the equipment, and certainly stresses our employees. Right. The cold weather is very hard for our operations, but we always run trains that have to get through. Now, tell the truth. How many of you knew that the wheel sets were not actually attached to the cars? Okay, good. There were at least a couple of you who knew that. So if you ever see wheels separated from the cars, it's because they're not actually attached to the cars. The car gets set and gravity holds it in place. And if gravity isn't holding it in place, that's not a good situation. Okay, so we're going to talk about railroads in general. A lot of the people in this audience already have some transportation experience, and so I'm kind of talking to experts in a way that I don't usually have the opportunity to do. But I still find, even when I talk to experts, that the railroad can be sort of a bit of a mystery. I'm on a lot of transportation-related planning groups, local, regional, state, and there is a general awareness that the railroads are going to play a role in helping to resolve some of the transportation and infrastructure challenges that are facing not only Houston, not only Texas, but also the country as a whole. But railroads are kind of a mystery to transportation planners. We're a little bit different than everybody else. For one thing, we're entirely private. So when you look at the trucks have roads, and the airlines have airports and air traffic controllers, and the waterways, the barges have locks and dams. But for the most part, the railroads are entirely private. Now, you can always all give me some examples where that's not 100% true, but for the most part, we're a private industry. And so transportation planners don't quite know where the insertion point is to engage with the railroads. Frankly, the same is true for us. We don't know exactly where that insertion point is either. We are a for-profit industry, just like all of the other modes. We fund our own infrastructure, so we fund our own railroad. Now, it is true that 150 years ago, 100 years ago, a lot of those corridors were given to the railroads so that they would come and build the railroad tracks. They were given by a public entity. They were given because those towns knew that if they didn't have a railroad, they didn't have a town. In fact, there was an article in the Chronicle just on Saturday about Magnolia being one example of many that when the railroad ran 1.5 miles away from them, they picked up the town, lock, stock, and barrel, and moved it to where the railroad was, because it was only with the railroad that they could have success. And so that kind of investment was important. A town, a state, a nation would give to railroad investors the right-of-way. The railroad would come in and build the right-of-way. So there's definitely a public engagement there on the railroads, but those right-of-ways were paid for decades ago through low-cost military transportation and hauling the mail for probably about 120 years. So now we come to today. We still fund our own infrastructure, and trying to find a way to engage collectively a private entity for the public good is kind of a challenge sometimes. Like the other modes, we also have federal oversight. Now, we have 150 years of federal oversight, so that gives us a bit more rules and regulations than a lot of the other industries have. Now, unlike the other modes, we also have what's called the common carrier obligation. The common carrier obligation means that if a shipper prepares the goods that meet transportation guidelines according to the federal government, and we are capable of carrying those goods, we are required by law to carry those goods. Part of that is because our safety record, because most people don't want nuclear waste traveling on roads adjacent to vehicles. And so they want it traveling on rail because we have a great safety record. Part of that common carrier obligation is also due to the fact that we were the way that people got to market for the first 100 years of America. So the government put in place certain protections that made sure that if a customer wanted to ship something and the railroad was there, the railroad was required to ship it. So that's that common carrier obligation. That's one of the major regulations that we have that affects the railroad. Now, how is this relevant to my topic? Well, the whole point of what I want to talk to you about today is really how is it that the railroads, which help to build the country, you know, our theme is building America. You see it right here, building America. The railroads that help to build the country are still a vital part of the economic development in the country. Now, because we are a private entity with our own set of obligations and our own set of priorities to serve our employees and our shareholders and our customers, we come at a development project from a business plan standpoint. Organizations like the h-gac, counties, other folks come at their priorities from a purely public interest standpoint. And so the challenge for all of us, and one of the reasons that several of you are here today probably, is to try to figure out where those priorities overlap. How is it that the public entities can leverage the sizable private investment that the railroads are making in order to benefit the public good? And so that's what I want to talk about today. So why am I showing you a picture that's 150 years old? This is Omaha, when there wasn't too much in Omaha other than the railroad. I show you this because it helps me explain why it is that railroad time is different than everybody else's time. Those of you who are consultants or counties who have dealt with the railroad before know what I mean when I talk about railroad time. It kind of goes on a little along sometimes. Well, that's because we tend to think in terms not of long-term planning and in years or necessarily, certainly not months, but in decades. Our long-term planning is done in decades because we're 150 years old. Now, in that 150 years, there's been a lot of ups and downs for the railroad. You know, in the late 1800s, the railroads were sort of the dot-com of the economy. There wasn't anything hotter than a railroad to become a part of back in the 1800s. But then by the 1890s, when there was a global financial crisis, hundreds of railroads, including Union Pacific, went bankrupt. By the World War I, the government took control of the railroads because they had to meet the military objectives. Then the 1920s and 1930s, there's been this huge heyday of passenger travel. By the 1970s, the railroads were bankrupt again. So it's been a whole cycle of ups and downs over that last 150 years, but through it all, the railroads have protected the core, which is our right-of-way. Today, I would say that the railroads are stronger than they've been in a century, and probably stronger than they have been in our entire existence, probably. And there are a lot of reasons for that, and we're going to talk about several of those. This year, the railroad industry as a whole will spend more than $26 billion on infrastructure. The railroad industry, $26 billion in private investment on infrastructure. Now, by comparison, and there are a lot of numbers out there, I'm going to give you the number that I was able to find most consistently. The federal government spends $40 billion on federal highway infrastructure. So railroads are spending $26 billion on private. Federal is spending $40 billion on highway infrastructure across the country. And all of you who are involved in transportation know that if something isn't done pretty soon, that kettle is going to be dry as well. So when you talk about how are we going to engage infrastructure, you know it's going to have to be done not just with government money, but also leveraging that private investment that we were talking about. Railroad infrastructure. Railroad infrastructure basically equals economic development. This doesn't happen to be Texas. This is Illinois. This is Rochelle, right outside Chicago. We call it Global 3. It's a massive intermodal facility. You can see all the trucks lined up here. I'm looking for I-80. This over here is I-80. There's not much development out there yet, but there will be because the railroads invest and they lay the groundwork for additional economic development. UP's investment in West Texas is a really good example that has some resonance locally. Over the last 20 years, well, since 1998, UP has spent $500 million on that line that serves West Texas, that El Paso to Shreveport line, the old Texas Pacific line. And most of that's been between Fort Worth and Sierra Blanca. The results are pretty clear from that expenditure. The traffic is up fourfold, and the trains travel 25% faster than they did because the amount of money we've put into improving that track. In the last couple of years, we've spent $40 million just on infrastructure out in the Odessa-Midland area. And that's brought in at least 7 new companies and several hundred new jobs. That investment in West Texas also serves Houston because for the West Texas drilling facility, we bring in pipe locally to a local supplier. We offload it here in Houston. The local supplier finishes the pipe, put it back on, and haul it back out. So that investment across the state influences jobs right here in Houston. So I talked about our right-of-way and protecting our right-of-way. We can invest in facilities across our system. We operate in 23 states, and we can invest in those intermodal facilities, and we can invest in landing and collection points. The one thing that's a lot harder to invest in or to expand in the future is our right-of-way. That's the line that connects the dots. It connects all those places between the collection and the delivery points. Again, I'm going to go back to West Texas as an example of why we view our right-of-way as so important to protect. Back in the 1990s, that West Texas line had about 4 trains a day, maybe 6 on a good day. It would have been a line that would have been ripe for abandonment. Back in the 1960s and 1970s, a lot of lines were abandoned. I'm sure that there were conversations in Omaha and elsewhere about why are we even maintaining this line? It cost a lot of money to maintain the line to federal standards. But we did. And it's a darn good thing because that line now serves that whole Permian Basin. Forbes magazine estimates that for every new oil or gas well drilled, it takes 40 rail cars of material. That's heavy stuff too.
Would you repeat that?
For every oil and gas well drilled, it takes 40 rail cars of material. Now you figure, just to have a number, that's probably, each of those heavy rail cars is probably about 4 trucks, right? So for every well drilled, 40 rail cars times 4 trucks, you're looking at 160 trucks per well, right? Anybody have any idea how many wells were drilled in Texas? 2012, the Railroad Commission indicates they issued 15,000 permits to dig wells. Now, the number, that would be 2.5 million trucks. Now, we know the numbers aren't that big, but the numbers are pretty staggering. And if that right-of-way, that all-important line that connects the dots, had been given up, then what you're seeing in West Texas with crumbling roads and asphalt going to gravel would be compounded exponentially. So those are the kinds of things that railroads do to serve the economic development interest. We don't necessarily just build rail, because that's the most expensive thing that we can do. So we do a lot of other kinds of things to make sure that we are maximizing our investment. We start out looking at processes. We want to make sure we're not reinventing that wheel. Sort of the Henry Ford school of thought. You know, let's find a way to do something. Let's make sure that it works. And if it works, let's keep doing it the same way. We have a huge number of new employees, and so we want to make sure those new employees know what they're supposed to do and how they're supposed to do it. And so UP Way is our version of talking about this is the way that we do things. We have organizational initiatives. We have a group that looks for quality improvement. They make sure that we do things the right way, the most efficient way, the best way. We have technology. Every day we have what we refer to as wayside detectors. They can detect if a load has shifted. They can detect if a wheel is hot. They can detect if there's something wrong with a rail car, if there's some sort of out of balance. We get 20 million data points every single day. 20 million data points that we analyze to make sure that there's nothing going on our railroad. Because if a wheel slips, that's going to cause damage to the track. And then we're going to have to go out and spend more money to fix it. So we want to collect those data points. And then the last thing we do if we have to is we put iron in the ground. When we're going to invest for economic development, when an entity comes to you and says, if you're in economic development, and they say, we think you're the perfect town for us, but what do you got to offer for rail service? We hope you've already talked to us, because it's going to take us up to 3 years to be prepared for that company to come in and invest in your community. Particularly if you're talking about a terminal, a facility, or locomotives are a year, mainline construction with permitting and land acquisition and all those other kinds of things can take up to 3 years. So we are out, we have an economic development department that is tasked specifically with working with communities and with counties and with states and all those folks to talk to organizations about, do you have economic development plans? I can't tell you how many folks in Texas and across the country think that a rail-served industrial park is the key to their future. So we're out there talking to those folks, because you can't just have a company come in and say, we want to operate here, can you get us some railroad? It takes some time to do it. So with all those kinds of investments, probably these numbers may not be all that surprising to you, but since 2000, Union Pacific has invested $42 billion in our infrastructure. That's just Union Pacific alone. And this year we just increased it, and I didn't get my chart fixed because it went off the top of the chart, but we've just increased it to $4.1 billion that we'll invest this year. So that's in equipment and improvements to track, expansion of track, capacity enhancements, facilities, all the things that we improve for our capacity are included in this number. And when you look at the statistics for the industry as a whole, all of the railroads since 1980 have spent $500 billion. Since 1980, $500 billion private investment in the infrastructure of the railroads. Okay, I'm going to pause and take a breath and see if anybody has any questions about all the information that I just gave you. Yes?
Just a general comment. You mentioned the stuff about the oil fields, how with the roads that actually prevented a lot more destruction to the roads. is there any kind of like joint partnership task force, something looking at maybe doing more of that type of infrastructure? Because those oil fields aren't going away anytime soon.
Well, and that's exactly the problem we have with where I started out, saying, you know, we're a private business that has to meet a private business plan, and the state is a public entity that has to look at public transportation for the public good. And where do we find those overlaps? And actually, Richard's boss, Judge Emmett, is chairing a TxDOT committee on freight to look at what the future freight needs of Texas will be and how, as a whole, all the modes can best address those needs. Did I do that justice?
Correct.
All right.
We're actually, one of our meetings in August is in Midland, Odessa.
Assuming we can find a hotel to stay in, because if you've ever been out there, the hotels are about $300 a night in Midland, Odessa. Yes, sir.
Exactly what is right-of-way? What authority do you appeal to for right-of-way?
Right-of-way is our reference to the property that we own that's almost always longitudinal. In other words, it's usually 50 to 100 to 250 feet wide. And it's the right-of-way that the railroad goes down to get from one customer or one place to another. The right-of-way is the railroads each privately own that right-of-way. So we don't have, so when we need to acquire right-of-way to expand, for example, we go through a process very much like any other entity where we go to the private landowner and try to arrange to buy it. I'm going to talk a little bit in a minute about a location up in Hearn where we're trying to acquire some property for a major expansion. So that's the process that we go through to do that. Because the railroads serve the public good, we do have eminent domain authority, but we use it as rarely as possible. We view that as something that is an absolute last course if we have to go that way in order to finish a project to serve a customer that is perhaps bringing in several hundred jobs.
So in doing that, you appeal to some local authority because of the purpose that you're using land for?
That goes back to kind of where I started out talking about the federal regulations. Generally speaking, railroads, almost all of the engagement of the railroad, because we do interstate commerce, is managed at the federal level. There are certainly some local and state regulations that we are obligated to abide by, but generally speaking, we're regulated at the federal level, and that includes those kinds of expansions.
What is your actual footage of right-of-way along the track? Does it change when it's in the inner city versus out in the country?
It changes dramatically, and not always because it's city or country. The question was, how wide is our right-of-way? It can go from 25, which is just barely enough to operate on. More typical is about 50. Preferred is about 100, and it can go to a couple hundred wide. And it really depends on what the railroad originally owned and whether any of that has been sold off over the course of the last 100 or 150 years.
Thank you.
Yes?
I have my original question and a follow-up question to something that you said. First of all, when you were talking about infrastructure, that's referring to the maintenance of the tracks and the railroad, the ties and so on and so forth, correct?
Yes.
All right. What is the maintenance schedule that Union Pacific has in Houston? Are you mandated to have a rotating schedule?
That's a far more complicated question than you might think it is, because the inspection schedule for track is dictated by the Federal Railroad Administration, the government agency that classifies track according to the amount of weight it carries, the amount of trains that operate over it, a variety of things, what kinds of good it hauls. The track is classified, and each classification of track has a different inspection schedule. But for a lot of the track we have here, we inspect it every 3 days. We have inspectors who are out in their vehicles. Probably everybody here has seen a truck on the rail. A lot of those trucks on the rail are actually inspectors who are out inspecting the track to make sure that it meets standards. Not just the federal standards, but our own internal standards, which typically are higher. And you had a follow-up?
Well, no, to follow up what I just asked you, is there I guess it all depends on how much weight it's carried and so forth, but is rail replaced, generally speaking, every 5 years, every 10 years, or do you have any kind of a general thing that you could tell us?
You know, it varies according to the amount of traffic on the line. So it is replaced whenever there is any indication that it needs to be replaced. Obviously, we're going to do it.
Okay.
Pardon me. But there's not a mandated schedule for when you have to, you know, that rail is X number of years old, it's time to remove it.
Yeah.
Certainly, way out in the wilds where our trains don't operate, you might see some rail that's been in the ground a very, very long time. In Houston, it wouldn't be nearly that long.
Right. Well, the follow-up question is about eminent domain. Since you're a private company, what legislation or whatever how does eminent domain come about and how?
You know, actually, there's a lot of private entities that have eminent domain authority, and the reason for that is they're serving the greater public good. So in the case of railroads, because we serve interstate commerce, in other words, we need to get goods from Houston, where they're produced, to Los Angeles, where they're going to be marketed. And so in order to serve that need, which serves the greater economic goods of the region, we need to be able to make sure that we are able to operate according to our needs. But we have to prove, like any other organization, that we have no other option, that this is the best option for the public good, and that we've offered a fair price to the individual who is going to be deprived of their property. So it's very, very restricted, very regulated.
And do you prove this to the federal government or the state officials?
Oof, boy, you're really testing my knowledge on that one. You know, I don't know the answer to that.
Would you be willing to find out?
Well, sure, we can find out the answer to that. I mean, that Texas has laws just like it. I imagine it's probably a Texas law. All right, let me get into this because I want to get to Houston. Okay, so this is the Union Pacific system. We are, by most measures, the largest railroad in the United States. This gives you a little bit of information, but most importantly, note that we're the only railroad that serves all of the rail crossings into Mexico. We serve all the West Coast ports, and we serve the Gulf ports, including some that don't have a little circle on them, you can see here. And now what I would do. Okay. Seems to have gone to sleep. All right, we have technical people coming up to help out.
And while she's doing that, the private industry has to prove they are what's called a common carrier. So for a pipeline, for example, to have eminent domain power, they have to show that they're moving other people's products beside their own. So Kinder Morgan can have domain rights because they're carrying Exxon and everybody else's oil. Well, they're carrying everybody else's products, so that's how they get into the stuff.
And do they get permission from Harris County? You said prove it, I just didn't know who they were proving it to get permission.
They prove the state of Texas.
Gotcha.
Thank you, Commissioner. I appreciate that. There are a lot of people in the room who are more knowledgeable about a lot of things than I am, so thank you for answering that. Okay, so let's talk about corridor planning a little bit. Obviously, we talked about that investment, where our investment follows the trends, the economic trends. So this was our original transcontinental route. Well, actually, it's not exactly because we didn't start in Chicago, but this is the coal route. Back in the 1980s, when coal was king, this is where we did most of our investment. Last year, for the first time ever, I think, coal did not finish as our top commodity. So we aren't investing solely in the coal route anymore. In the 1990s, we acquired the Southern Pacific. We had the access to that Los Angeles and that southern tier. We started to invest heavily in that southern tier, so we could get goods from Los Angeles over to the Gulf Coast ports and on up to Chicago. Now it's all about the South, and I'm not telling you folks anything that you don't already know. This is where the people are. This is where the jobs are. This is where the economy is. I must be hitting the wrong button here. So we have several routes to the South that we're investing in very heavily. Just as I said, you already know this, but the Texas State Data Center projects a nearly 70% increase in the state's population by 2040. So that means all of those people who want jobs, who want goods, who want houses, who want cars, all those things that we haul are coming to the south. That big red X there, that's Hearn. Now, those of you who know Hearn know that they already call themselves the crossroads of Texas. That's because that's where all the roads meet. Well, guess what? That's where most of the railroads meet as well. There are 7 Union Pacific subdivisions that meet at Hearn. We have a major project under development. It is not a definite project yet, but it's very much under consideration to build a large yard at Hearn that will to some extent give us a relief valve. So as we fill up in Houston, which we increasingly are doing, we have someplace we can take some of those cars. That'll be about a $400 million investment if it's built as planned. So why focus on the south? Well, this is kind of just a random set of Chronicle and other newspaper articles that I could have picked out any day of the week. You could find articles that talk about the record number of investments in housing starts and chemical expansions because of natural gas and oil and gas and drilling and all those things. These are the things that are driving the development in Texas for the railroad as well as the development for all of you. Now, you've all heard the statistics, I think, because our counterpart railroads in the east run a lot of very beautiful ads about one train takes 300 trucks off the road. That's the lightweight stuff. When you're starting to talk about sand and gravel and heavy stuff and things, chemicals that trucks don't haul because they don't want them on the roadways, then you start talking about even more than 300 trucks per train. So let's talk about Houston now. Again, this is not news to any of you. Commodities with significant growth are the ones that predominate in Houston. Energy and byproducts, drilling materials, chemicals, and Mexico. We didn't talk too much about Mexico, but I did mention that Union Pacific is the only railroad that serves all 6 of the Mexican ports. Mexico is a location where we're doing a lot of nearshoring as a country. We're moving a lot of jobs into Mexico from overseas. We expect that Mexico market to increase pretty dramatically, and most of it comes up through Houston, certainly through Texas, obviously, but much of it arrives through Houston. Houston is consistently our highest volume service unit. Service unit is a fairly broad definition for us. It's not just Houston proper. It goes out towards Baytown, and it's a fairly broad number, but it's our largest service unit. And Inglewood alone, which is the picture you see behind, and it's the picture that was up on the screen when we started out, is averages 1,500 cars a day. I'll show you a map of the Houston railroad system in a minute, but because Union Pacific is by far the largest railroad in Houston, we dispatch all of the trains, which means all of the trains that move in Houston, when the dispatcher comes on the radio and says, you can now move that train, it's a Union Pacific dispatcher doing it, or a BNSF dispatcher at our facility. We dispatch 100 trains, more than 100, that's a fairly conservative number, just in this Houston terminal complex, which is kind of Houston proper. So, 100 trains a day, what does that mean to your daily commute? Because all of us commute, right? Okay, this is tough math. And every one of you can tell me I'm wrong about this, and you're probably right. But this is as close as I can get. So, if you use a standard 1 rail car equals 3 trucks, we handle the equivalent of more than 15,000 truckloads of goods per day in Houston. Now, if you look at the Tex.Truck flow band map, okay, that's their official count of how many trucks operate in the Texas area, you pick almost any point around Houston on the map and do a 24-hour truck count, it's in the ballpark of 15,000 trucks. If that freight that we carry every single day here were pulled off the railroad and you put those 15,000 truck equivalents onto the road, they would be stacked nose to tail, as would the rest of us be stacked nose to tail, and they would consume more than 200 lane miles in the Houston area. So without just Union Pacific, and that's not counting the other railroads in the area, without just Union Pacific, truck traffic on Houston freeways could as much as double. I'm not telling you that this is solid math, but this is a way to think about what railroads do on a daily commute. So how do we manage that? Well, since 2009, we've invested $2.5 billion in Texas, and $600 million of that just in the Houston area. You can kind of see how we've done that. You see that $500 million of that is on track renewal. That's that track replacement and whatnot in the Houston area. And we have a whole lot of projects that we anticipate going forward. This is a Houston area map that I promised you. All of these, and it's thanks to the h-gac. I think this is your map through TxDOT. All of those red lines are Union Pacific. The green lines here, that's BNSF. This purple is the PTRA, the Port Terminal Railroad Association. This is the Houston Belt and Terminal, which is owned essentially by BNSF and UP. And then this here, these gold lines here, those are the abandoned rail lines that in many cases were sold or donated to the city. I think this is now, yeah, this is basically I-10. It was the I-10 expansion here.
It's difficult to see your partner.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Where's Inglewood?
Inglewood is over in this vicinity. Here, right there. Right up there. That big yellow blob, or big red blob. Okay, so you can see, and all of these yellow dots are industry location, according to the size of their facility. All right, so why does everybody ship rail? Well, beyond the fact that it's the easiest, we haul heavy stuff, we've been hauling it for a long time, we haul chemicals and other things that people don't haul, there's a lot of other benefits that go along with rail. We're 3 times cleaner than trucks on a ton-mile basis. If you look at this pie chart up here, freight railroads haul 43% of the inner city goods based on ton miles. But if you look at greenhouse gas emissions, freight railroads are responsible for less than 10%, right around 9% of the emissions. So we're hauling 43% of the goods, but only producing 9% of the emissions. That's because we're so much cleaner and more fuel efficient. And as you've seen on those great commercials that I mentioned earlier, a train can haul a ton of freight, 480 miles on a gallon of fuel. Because once you get those steel wheels rolling on steel rail, there's no friction. And it doesn't take much fuel to keep it rolling. It takes a lot of fuel to get it started, but it doesn't take much fuel to keep it rolling. So we're extremely fuel efficient. So when you see a big old ship coming into port loaded with goods, it can either go to rail or it can go to your daily commute. And so when you start thinking about infrastructure and how we're going to deal with infrastructure and how we're going to capitalize on what the railroads are investing, these are the kinds of conversations that we have. So just sort of a quick summary of what we talked about. We're hauling about the equivalent of what you would, of the daily trucks on any particular portion of highway in Houston. This is the city where 17 railroads met the sea. This city was founded on railroads. We go to all of those industry, we go to the port, we serve all of those goods. We have been doing it for more than 100 years. We're investing very heavily, and we're going to continue to invest to foster economic development, not just here in Houston, but in Texas and across the region. And that is Inglewood on a not very busy day. What kind of questions can I answer?
Can you,
Yes, sir.
Describe to people who haven't been to Inglewood what happens there briefly?
I'm looking for the, well, this is what's referred to as a hump yard, and you probably can't see it anyway. You just see all these tracks. This is where we receive and build trains. So a customer will, a chemical customer will say, okay, here's a train load of plastic pellets. And they have to go to these 5 plants, and 2 of them are in California, and 2 of them are in Chicago, and 1 of them's in Missouri. So we're going to bring that load of plastic pellets into here as a single unit, and then we're going to ship it, we're going to disperse it out to the right train. So let's say the train over there is going to Illinois, and this one's going to Missouri, and that one's going to California. So that train is going to come in. There's going to be a control up there that's going to be switching cars onto the right tracks. So it's a switch yard, a hump yard. There's a lot of things that we can call that, but this is where the work is done so that goods that come in from the manufacturers who are here in Houston go out to all the places they have to go out to.
So is this like a garage?
Is it a garage?
Yeah, maintenance garage along with the...
I don't, Raquel, I would have to, do we have any sort of locomotive or car facility?
We do have a locomotive shop there that can do some repairs. It's there right by the property right next to it.
Okay, so what, and Raquel, my colleague Raquel, excuse me, had commented that we do have a locomotive repair facility here at Englewood, so that the locomotives, like virtually everything else, have to be serviced on a certain standard schedule, and so some of that service can be done at this facility.
So Englewood's primary purpose is to redistribute wherever they go.
Englewood is our distribution center, if you like to think of it in warehousing terms.
Was that the Beltway, northeast corner of the Beltway? Highway 8?
On the, when you were on the map?
Yeah.
I don't think so. Let me. Oh yeah, yeah, it's inside 610. Yeah.
610. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. Oh yes, you did. Yes, thank you.
Fuel is diesel. I presume you do that by long-term contracts, and then you have storage.
Oh, there are so many different ways to handle diesel, and we alternate, and I don't know what the answer is right now for how we're handling our diesel. Yes, it is diesel. We use a massive amount of fuel. We're obviously looking at some other alternatives. In some of the yards in California, we have sort of a diesel-electric hybrid that we use. A couple of railroads, including Union Pacific, are looking at the viability of LNG to see if that's something that we can use in the future. Just like cars, it's very hard to do long-distance travel when you don't know where the next gas station is. And so that's our problem with LNG, but we're looking at it, and you know, that's why we've been here 150 years, because we're pretty good at pivoting on technology to make sure that we're doing things most efficiently.
But the train really doesn't run on diesel, does it?
The train doesn't run on diesel, it runs on electricity. Yeah. The diesel engine powers a battery, which stores the electricity, which then powers the locomotive.
So it's a battery operated.
That is as much as I know, so do not ask me another question about that.
You can hear those generators.
Yes.
If you sit in there and listen to them try to get started, they get those generators on it.
Yes. Yes, ma'am.
I myself and others have been concerned about security
Mm-hmm.
on the rail industry in general all across the country. One of the reasons, which is a minor concern, is we have an absolute art gallery passing us every day of the incredibly talented graffiti artists and taggers that have gotten into the rail yards and done this. That's of less concern, but also, and I'm not a person that gets hysterical about terrorists and all that sort of thing, but the other, you know, the airlines and so forth, concerned about the security at the rail yards or places where someone could actually, you know, misuse that particular industry.
Well, security is of topmost concern to us as well. We have for more than 100 years had our own private security force. They're fully, they're federal law officers. They're able to write tickets. They have arresting powers in all the states. They keep close tabs on our railroad. A lot of what I talked about with those wayside detectors, I can tell you we have a whole lot of cameras out there as well. We know when somebody's where they shouldn't be. We work very closely with CBP to make sure we're managing Customs and Border Patrol to make sure that we're managing immigration issues. We have a lot of heat sensing devices on the borders. And we are very engaged with Homeland Security and with federal forces to make sure that we have regular reporting with them and that we know exactly what kind of threats might have been issued and that we are doing what they think is the safest way for us to operate. So it's a concern to us and we take good care with it.
Thank you, wonderful.
Yes, sir.
Kind of a broad question, but you know, back in the last century, the rise of trucking, overland trucking, had a significant impact on the economics of freight rail, and obviously things have changed since then. How would you describe the competitive or collaborative relationship that freight rail industry has today with the trucking industry in terms of your place in the competitive landscape and how you work with the trucking industry?
I would say it is competitive and collaborative. Railroads will never reach every single Walmart, nor should we reach every single Walmart. There will always be trucks who deliver that final mile. And all those goods that you see coming off in those boxes travel to the nearest distribution point, whether it's Joliet, Illinois, or Dallas, Texas, where they're then picked up by a truck for that final mile. But the most efficient way most economical and cleanest way for them to travel long distance is by rail. And so that's the business we compete most strenuously for, and that's what we're the best at. But trucks will always be there to haul them that final mile to delivery at the dock. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Two-part, if that's okay. How big a deal is freight congestion in the Houston system? And since we have so many at-grade crossings with the interface surface road system, what are you doing on both of those?
Those are two great questions. You know, the amount we're spending in Houston, that $500 million, is our best effort to make sure that we don't become overly congested. But we have a lot going on in Houston, and there is a lot on the way to continue in Houston. We're very concerned about that. We're working with Judge Emmett, with h-gac, with others to make sure that we're all addressing the potential congestion that's headed our way. We're investing, but we're trying to keep really close tabs on that to make sure that we're able to build where we need to build in order to serve those interests. In terms of grade crossings, anytime you have a train and a car potentially intersecting, nothing good can come of it. So it is far better to eliminate or reduce as much as possible any of those intersections. But we also recognize that while the railroad, helped to build the city has built around it, and you need to get from one place to another. I like to think of the railroad as a river. You need to build a bridge to cross it, but sometimes those bridges can be pretty expensive, and so sometimes you have to go at grade. What we do in accordance with federal guidelines is if there needs to be a new crossing, we're going to look at some roadways that maybe don't have to be there anymore. As a country, we had gotten into the habit of just throwing gravel wherever you thought you needed a crossing. And so, especially in small towns, you'll have literally a crossing every block. And I promise you somebody who lives on that block uses that crossing. But it wouldn't take them that much time to go one block down the street. And it would be safer for everybody if they did. Now I can tell you the commissioner's had some probably unpleasant conversations with constituents when he talks about maybe we'll just close that railroad crossing and you can go a block out of your way. They do not like it. And so we work very closely with government entities because they do have to approve the closure of a roadway. That's not something that we unilaterally undertake. But we work very closely. We think that's an important safety device, an important safety process, and we really want to improve safety as much as we can.
But if governments decide to put a crossing over a railroad, maybe not Union Pacific, but maybe another one, you can be in a lawsuit with the railroad for the last 14 years.
Just like we have to get permission to close a road, they have to get permission to cross our railroad. And so sometimes we can come to loggerheads on those issues.
Will there be another opportunity for questions, or is this?
I can stay a little while longer if you'd like.
No, I mean, I have one question now, if there's not going to be a...
I see there's one question here.
I don't mean to go ahead. I just meant, are you going to speak some more?
No, I'm done. I'm done talking. We're just questions now. Yes.
Well, the other question, when you're talking about crossings, is there an advantage from the railroad's viewpoint of having an underpass versus an overpass?
We prefer overpasses. Just like any landowner, if you go under us, you have created an island. And if we were to need to serve more customers and we needed another track, now we don't have the room to build another track. So that's always a preference to go over so that you don't interrupt our ability to serve future needs. That is more expensive oftentimes, but it's always preferable to the railroad. Always. No one person should never say always. It's almost always preferable to the railroad.
Even if it's an established track that's been there a long time, you still want the option 10 years from now. So that would have to be part of a planning process.
That goes back to that West Texas example in planning for decades. 20 years ago, no one would have imagined that West Texas might possibly need it, but we've spent $500 million there because we needed so much extra capacity to meet what's going on now. So that's exactly the kind of reason we would do that. I'm going to check to see anyone else. Yes, ma'am, you have one last question.
Yes, I have. It's a three-part question.
Okay.
Actually. What is who manufactures the the cars that you transport, the oil and the toxic chemicals?
There are a variety of manufacturers. I don't know who they all are. There are not a lot of them.
Specific uses.
I will tell you, so this may divert your questions a little bit. Union Pacific does not own those cars. It's the shipper who owns the cars. So the shipper purchases a car that meets federal standards according to the goods that are going to be put into the car. And once the shipper has met those federal standards and they give us that car, we're obligated to take it where they tell us they want it to go. So we don't have really anything to say about the car that the product is being hauled in, as long as it meets federal standards.
Gotcha. Okay, then a follow-up question is, how do citizens is it possible for us to get a list, meaning the public, anyone who's concerned about it, of the specific items that are being, I was absolutely horrified when you said nuclear waste. But anyway, that's an aside, but is it possible for us to get a list of what you all are transporting? Obviously, we can assume some things, crude oil, chemical this, chemical that, but to actually know what is going through our neighborhoods?
Well, for exactly the reasons that you mentioned earlier about security, the federal government has told us that they would like to know what's going through, but they would like not everyone else to know what's going through, because they consider that to be not necessarily the most secure way to handle, because people who don't have pure intentions
I understand what you're saying.
might have some nefarious ideas about what they would do. So we have extensive relationships with emergency responders throughout the country. We train them, we provide information, and in fact, because of this issue that's going on with crude oil right now, the federal government has just issued some new guidelines that we're all trying to figure out exactly what it means, where we will provide some real-time information to those emergency responders in the state so they know exactly what's going through their state, when it's going through their state. So that particular question is in the process of being worked out, even more than it has been already.
Okay, I think that's the end of
I think we're done. It's 1 o'clock. Thank you so much for your attention. I appreciate it.